All right, then. Hello, and welcome to Storytime with Alaric. I am here with my lovely lemon tea. A wee bit on the early side, but I don't think it really matters that much right now. And today we are reading Dan Zimmern's Hyperion. I believe this will be part 4, and we are about to read Day 107 of A Priest's Tale. So, here we go. Day 107. I am a prisoner. This morning I was bathing in my usual place, near where the stream drops over the cliff edge, when I heard a sound and looked up to see the Baikura I called Dell staring at me with wide eyes. I called a greeting, but the little Baikura turned and ran. I thought it was perplexing. They rarely hurry. Then I realized that even though I had been wearing trousers at the time, I had undoubtedly violated their nudity taboo by allowing Dell to see me naked from the waist up. I smiled, shook my head, finished dressing, and returned to the village. If I had known what awaited me there, I would not have been amused. The entire 70 stood watching as I approached. I stopped a dozen paces from Al. "Good afternoon," I said. Alpha pointed, and half a dozen of the Baikura lunged towards me, seized my arms and legs, and pinned me to the ground. Beta stepped forward and removed the sharp-edged stone from his or her robes. As I struggled in vain to pull free, Beta cut my clothes down the front and pulled apart the shreds until I was all but naked. I ceased struggling as the mob pressed forward. They stared at my pale, white body and murmured to themselves. I could feel my heart pounding. "I'm sorry if I have offended your laws," I began, "but there is no reason." "Silence," said Alpha, and spoke to the tall Baikura with the scar on his palm, the one I call Zed. "He is not of the cruciform." Zed nodded. "Let me explain," I began again, but Alpha silenced me with a backhanded slap that left my lip bleeding and my ears ringing. There had been no more sense of hostility in his action than I would have shown in silencing a comlock by throwing a switch. "What are we to do with him?" asked Alpha. "Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death," said Beta, and the crowd shifted forward. Many had sharpened stones in their hands. "Those not of the cruciform must die the true death," said Beta, and her voice held the tone of complacent finality common to oft-repeated formulae in religious litanies. "I follow the cross," I cried out as the crowd tugged me to my feet. I grabbed at the crucifix that hung around my neck and struggled against the pressure of many arms. Finally, I managed to lift the little cross over my head. Alpha held up his hands, and the crowd paused. In the sudden silence, I could hear the river 3 kilometers below us in the cleft. "He does carry a cross," said Alpha. Dell pressed forward. "But he is not of the cruciform. I saw. It was not as we thought. He is not of the cruciform." There was murder in his voice. I cursed myself for being careless and stupid. The future of the church depended upon my survival, and I had thrown both away by beguiling myself into believing that the Baikura were dull, harmless children. "Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death," repeated Beta. It was a final sentencing. Stones were being raised by 70 hands when I shouted, knowing that it was either my last chance or my final condemnation. "I have been down the cliff, and I have worshipped at your altar. I follow the cross." Alpha and the mob hesitated. I could see that they were wrestling with this new thought. It was not easy for them. "I follow the cross and wish to be of the cruciform," I said as calmly as I could. "I have been to your altar." "Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death," called Gamma. "But he follows the cross," said Alpha. "He has prayed in the room." "This cannot be," said Zed. "The 70 pray there, and he is not of the 70. "We knew before this that he is not of the 70, said Alpha, frowning slightly as he dealt with the concept of past tense. "He is not of the cruciform," said Delta 2. "Those who are not of the cruciform must die the true death," said Beta. "He follows the cross," said Alpha. "Can he not become of the cruciform?" An outcry arose. In the general babble and shuffle of forms, I pulled against the restraining hands, but their grips remained firm. "He is not of the 70 and is not of the cruciform," said Beta, sounding more puzzled than hostile now. "How is it that he should not die the true death? We must take stones and open his throat so that the blood flows until his heart stops. He is not of the cruciform." "He follows the cross," said Alpha. Can he not become of the cruciform? This time silence followed the question. He follows the cross and has prayed in the room of the cruciform, said Alpha. He must not die the true death. All die the true death, said a Bakura whom I did not recognize. My arms were aching from the strain of holding the crucifix above my head. Except the 70, finished the anonymous Bakura. Because they followed the cross, prayed at the room, and became of the cruciform, said Alpha. Must he not then become of the cruciform? I stood there, gripping the cold metal of the small cross, and awaited their verdict. I was afraid to die. I felt afraid, but the larger part of my mind seemed almost detached. My greatest regret was that I would not be able to send out the news of the basilica to an unbelieving universe. Come, we will talk of this, Beta said to the group, and they pulled me with them as they trod silently back to the village. They have imprisoned me here in my hut. There was no chance to try for the hunting mazer. Several of them held me down while they emptied the hut of most of my possessions. They took my clothing, leaving me only one of their rough woven robes to cover myself with. The longer I sit here, the more angry and anxious I become. They have taken my comlog, imager, discs, chips, everything. I have a single unopened crate of medical diagnostic equipment left up at the old site, but they cannot help me document the miracle in the cleft. If they destroy the things they have taken, and then destroy me, there will be no record of the basilica. If I had a weapon, I could kill the guards and... Oh, dear God, what am I thinking? Edouard, what am I to do? And even if I survive this, make my way back to Keats, arrange travel back to the web, who would believe me? After 9 years' absence from Passam because of the quantum leap and time debt, just an old man returning with the same lies he was exiled for. Oh, dear God, if they destroy the data, let them destroy me as well. Day 110. After 3 days, they have decided my fate. Zed, and the one I think of as Theta Prime, came to get me shortly after midday. I blinked as they led me out into the light. The 70 stood in a wide semicircle near the cliff edge. I fully expected to be thrown over that edge. Then I noticed the bonfire. I had assumed that the Baikura were so primitive that they had lost the art of making and using fire. They did not warm themselves with fire, and their huts were always dark. I had never seen them cook a meal, not even the rare corpse of an arboreal they devoured. But now the fire was burning strongly, and they were the only ones who could have started it. I looked to see what fueled the flames. They were burning my clothes, my comlog, my field notes, the tape cassettes, video chips, data disks, the imager, everything that had held information. I screamed at them, tried to throw myself at the fire, and called them names I had not used since the street days of my childhood. They ignored me. Finally, Alpha came close. You will become of the cruciform, he said softly. I did not care. They led me back to my hut where I wept for an hour. There was no guard at the door. A minute ago, I stood at the doorway and considered running for the flame forests. Then I thought of a much shorter, but no less fatal run to the cleft. I did nothing. The sun will be setting in a short time. Already the winds are rising. Soon, soon. Day 112. Has it been only 2 days? It has been forever. It did not come off this morning. It did not come off. The med scanner's image wafer is right here in front of me, but I still cannot believe it. And yet I do. I am of the cruciform now. They came for me just before sunset. All of them. I did not struggle as they led me to the edge of the cleft. They were more agile on the vines than I could have imagined. I slowed them down, but they were patient, showing me the easiest footholds, the fastest route. Hyperion's sun had dropped below low clouds and was visible above the rim wall to the west as we walked the final few meters to the basilica. The evening wind song was louder than I had anticipated. It was as if we were caught amid the pipes of a gigantic church organ. The notes rose from bass growls so deep that my bones and teeth resonated in sympathy, to high, piercing screams that slid easily into the ultrasonic. Alpha opened the outer doors, and we passed through the antechamber into the central basilica. The 70 made a wide circle around the altar and its tall cross. There was no litany, There was no singing, there was no ceremony. We simply stood there, in silence, as the wind roared through the fluted columns outside and echoed in the great empty room carved into the stone. Echoed and resonated and grew in volume until I clapped my hands over my ears. All the while the streaming horizontal rays of sunlight filled the hall with deepening hues of amber, gold, lapis, and then amber again, colors so deep that they made the air thick with light and lay like paint against the skin. I watched as the cross caught this light and held it in each of its 1,000 precious stones, held it, it seemed, even after the sun had set and the windows had faded to a twilight gray. It was as if the crucifix had absorbed the light and was radiating it toward us, into us. Then even the cross was dark, and the winds died, and in the sudden dimness, Alpha said softly, "Bring him along." We emerged into the wide ledge of stone, and Beta was there with torches. As Beta passed them out to a selected few, I wonder if the Biker reserved fire for ritual purposes only. Then Beta was leading the way, and we descended the narrow staircase carved into the stone. At first I crept along, terrified, clutching at the smooth rock and searching for any reassuring projection of root or stone. The drop to our right was so sheer and endless that it bordered on being absurd. Descending the ancient staircase was far worse than clutching at vines on the cliff face above. Here I had to look down each time I placed a foot on the narrow, age-slickened slabs. A slip and a fall at first seemed probable, then inevitable. I had the urge to stop them, to return at least to the safety of the basilica, but most of the 70 were behind me on the narrower staircase, and there seemed little chance that they would stand aside to let me pass. Beside this, and even greater than my fear, was the nagging curiosity about what was at the bottom of the staircase. I did pause, long enough to glance up at the lip of the cleft 300 meters above, and to see that the clouds were gone. The stars were out, and the nightly ballet of meteor trails was bright against a sable sky. Then I lowered my head, began a whispered recitation of the rosary, and followed the torchlight and the Bikura into the treacherous depths. I could not believe that the staircase would take us all the way to the bottom of the cleft, but it did. When, sometime after midnight, I realized that we would be descending all the way down to the level of the river, I estimated that it would take us until noon of the next day, but it did not. We reached the base of the cleft shortly before sunrise. The stars still shone in the aperture of the sky between cliff walls that rose an impossible distance on either side. Exhausted, staggering downward step by step, recognizing slowly that there were no more steps, I stared upward and wondered stupidly if the stars remained visible there in the daylight, as they did in a well I had lowered myself into once as a child in the Villefranche-sur-Saône. "Here," said Beta. It was the first word uttered in many hours, and was barely audible over the roar of the river. The 70 stopped where they were and stood motionless. I collapsed to my knees and fell on my side. There was no possibility that I could climb that staircase we had just descended. Not in a day, not in a week, perhaps never. I closed my eyes to sleep, but the dull fuel of nervous tension continued to burn inside me. I looked out across the floor of the ravine. The river here was wider than I had anticipated, at least 70 meters across, and the noise of it was beyond mere noise. It felt that I was being consumed by a great beast's roar. I sat up and stared at a patch of darkness in the opposing cliff wall. It was a shadow darker than shadows, more regular than the serrated patchwork of buttresses and crevices and columns that modeled the face of the cliff. It was a perfect square of darkness, at least 30 meters to a side. A door, or a hole in the cliff wall. I struggled to my feet and looked downriver along the wall we had just descended. Yes, it was there. The other entrance, the one toward which Beta and the others even now were walking, was faintly visible in the starlight. I had found an entrance to Hyperion's labyrinth. "Did you know that Hyperion was one of the 9 labyrinthine worlds?" someone had asked me on the dropship. Yes, it was the young priest named Hoyt. I had said yes and dismissed that fact. I was interested in the Bikura, actually more in the self-inflicted pain of my own exile, not the labyrinths or their builders. 9 worlds have labyrinths. 9 out of 176 web worlds, and another 200 some colonial and protectorate planets. 9 worlds out of 8,000 or more worlds explored, however cursorily, since the Hegra. There are planetary archaeohistorians who devote their lives to the study of the labyrinths. Not I. I had always found them a sterile topic, vaguely unreal. Now I walked toward one with the 70 as the Cannes River roared and vibrated and threatened to douse our torches with its spray. The labyrinths were dug, tunneled, created more than 750,000 standard years ago. The details were inevitably the same, their origins inevitably unsolved. Labyrinthian worlds are always Earth-like, at least to a 7.9 on the Solomth scale, always circling a G-type star, and yet always restricted to worlds that are tectonically dead, more like Mars than old Earth. The tunnel themselves are set deep, usually a minimum of 10 kilometers, but often as deep as 30, and they catacomb the crust of the planet. On Svoboda, not far from the Passam system, over 800,000 kilometers of labyrinth have been explored by remotes. The tunnels on each world are 30 meters square and carved by some technology still not available to the hegemony. I read once in an archaeological journal that Kemp-Holzer and Weinstein had postulated a fusion tunneler that would explain the perfectly smooth walls and lack of tailings, but their theory did not explain where the builders or their machines had come from or why they had devoted centuries to such an apparently aimless engineering task. Each of the labyrinthine worlds, including Hyperion, has been probed and researched. Nothing has ever been found. No signs of excavation machinery, no rusting miners' helmets, not a single piece of shattered plastic or decomposing stim-stick wrappers. Researchers have not even identified entrances and exit shafts. No suggestion of heavy metals or precious ores has been sufficient to explain such a monumental effort. No legend or artifact of the labyrinth builders has survived. The mystery had mildly intrigued me over the years, but never concerned me. Until now. We entered the tunnel mouth. It was not a perfect square. Erosion and gravity had turned the perfect tunnel into a rough cave for 100 meters into the cliff wall. Beta stopped just where the tunnel floor grew smooth and extinguished his torch. The other Baikura did likewise. It was very dark. The tunnel had turned enough to block out any starlight that might have entered. I had been in caves before. With the torches extinguished, I did not expect my eyes to adapt to the near total darkness, but they did. Within 30 seconds, I began to sense a rosalate glow, dim at first, then ever richer until the cave was brighter than the canyon had been, brighter than Passam under the glow of its triune moons. The light came from 100 sources, 1,000 sources. I was able to make out the nature of these sources just as the Baikura dropped reverently to their knees. The cave walls and ceilings were encrusted with crosses, ranging in size from a few millimeters to almost a meter long. Each glowed with a deep pink light of its own. Invisible in the torchlight, these glowing crosses now suffused the tunnel with light. I approached one embedded in the wall nearest me. 30 or so centimeters across, it pulsed with a soft, organic glow. This was not something that had been carved out of stone or attached to the wall. It was definitely organic, definitely alive, resembling soft coral. It was slightly warm to the touch. There came the slightest whisper of sound. No, not sound, a disturbance in the cool air, perhaps, and I turned in time to see something enter the chamber. The Baikura were still kneeling, their heads down, eyes lowered. I remained standing. My gaze never left the thing which moved among the kneeling Baikura. It was vaguely man-shaped, but in no way human. It stood at least 3 meters tall. Even when it was at rest, the silvered surface of the thing seemed to shift and flow like mercury suspended in midair. The reddish glow from the crosses set into the tunnel walls, reflected from sharp surfaces and glinted on the curved metal blades protruding from the thing's forehead, 4 wrists, oddly jointed elbows, knees, armored back, and thorax. It flowed between the kneeling Baikura, and when it extended 4 long arms, hands extended but fingers clicking into place like chrome scalpels, I was absurdly reminded of His Holiness on Passim offering a benediction to the faithful. I had no doubt that I was looking at the legendary Shrike. At that moment I must have moved or made a sound, for large red eyes turned my way, and I found myself hypnotized by the dance of light within the multifaceted prisms there. Not merely reflected light, but a fierce, blood-bright glow, which seemed to burn within the creature's barbed skull and pulse in the terrible gems set where God meant eyes to be. Then it moved, or rather, it did not move, but ceased being there and was here, leaning less than a meter from me, its oddly jointed arms encircling me in a fence of body blades and liquid silver steel. Panting hard, but unable to take a breath, I saw my own reflection, face white and distorted, dancing across the surface of the thing's metallic shell and burning eyes. I confess that I felt something closer to exaltation than fear. Something inexplicable was happening. Forged in Jesuit logic and tempered in the cold bath of science, I nevertheless understood that at that second, the ancient obsession of the God-fearing for another kind of fear, the thrill of exorcism, the mindless whirl of dervish possession, the puppet dance ritual of tarot, the almost erotic surrender of seance, speaking in tongues and Zen-gonastic trance. I realized at that instant just how surely the affirmation of demons or the summoning of Satan somehow can affirm the reality of their mystic antithesis, the God of Abraham. Thinking none of this, but feeling all of it, I awaited the embrace of the Shrike with the imperceptible tremble of a virgin bride. It disappeared. There was no thunderclap, no sudden smell of brimstone, not even the scientifically sound inrush of air. 1 second, the thing was there, surrounding me with its beautiful certainty of sharp-edged death. The next instant, it was gone. Numbed, I stood there and blinked as Alpha rose and approached me in the Bosch-tinted gloom. He stood where the Shrike had stood, his own arms extended in pathetic imitation of the deadly perfection I had just witnessed. But there was no sign on Alpha's bland, Baikura face that he had seen the creature. He made an awkward, open-handed gesture which seemed to include the labyrinth, cave wall, and scores of glowing crosses embedded there. Cruciform, said Alpha. The 70 rose, came closer, and knelt again. I looked at their placid faces in the soft light, and I also knelt. You will follow the cross all of your days, said Alpha, and his voice carried the cadence of litany. The rest of the Baikura repeated the statement in a tone just short of a chant. You will be of the cruciform all of your days, said Alpha. And as the others repeated this, he reached out and pulled a small cruciform away from the cave wall. It was not more than a dozen centimeters long, and it came away from the wall with the faintest of snaps. Its glow faded, even as I watched. Alpha removed a small thong from his robe, tied it around small knobs at the top of the cruciform, and held the cross above my head. You will be of the cruciform, now and forever, he said. Now and forever, echoed the Baikura. Amen, I whispered. Beta signaled that I should open the front of my robe. Alpha lowered the small cross until it hung around my neck. It felt cool against my chest. The back of it was perfectly flat, perfectly smooth. The Baikura stood and wandered toward the cave entrance, apparently apathetic and indifferent once again. I watched them leave, and then I gingerly touched the cross, lifted it, and inspected it. The cruciform was cool, inert. If it had truly been living a few seconds earlier, it showed no signs of it now. It continued to feel more like coral than crystal or rock. There was no sign of any adhesive material on the smooth back of it. I speculated on photochemical effects that would have created the luminescent quality. I speculated on natural phosphors, bioluminescence, and on the chances that evolution would shape such things. I speculated on what, if anything, their presence here had to do with the labyrinth, and on the aeons necessary to raise this plateau so the river and canyon could slice through one of the tunnels. I speculated on the basilica and its makers, on the Bikura, on the Shrike, and on myself. Eventually, I ceased speculation and closed my eyes to pray. When I emerged from the cave, the cruciform cool against my chest under the robe, the 70 were obviously ready to begin the 3-kilometer climb up the staircase. I looked up to see a pale slash of morning sky between the walls of the cleft. Oh, excuse me. No, I shouted, my voice almost lost amongst the roar of the river. I need rest. Rest! I sank to my knees on the sand, but 6 of the Bikura approached, pulled me gently to my feet, and moved me toward the staircase. I tried. The Lord knows that I tried, but 2 or 3 hours into the climb, I felt my legs give way, and I collapsed, sliding across the rock, unable to stop my 600-meter fall to the rocks and river. I remember grasping at the cruciform under the thick robe, and then 6 hands stopped my slide, lifted me, carried me. Then I remember no more. Until this morning. I awoke to a sunrise, pouring light through the opening of my hut. I wore only the robe, and a touch assured me that the cruciform was still hanging from its fibrous thong. As I watched the sun lift over the forest, I realized that I had lost a day, that somehow I had slept through not only my ascent up the endless staircase. How could these little people carry me 2.5 vertical kilometers? But through the next day and night as well. I looked around my hut. My comm log and other recording devices were gone. Only my med scanner and a few packets of anthropological software, made useless by the destruction of my other equipment, remained. I shook my head and went up to the stream to wash. The Bikura appeared to be sleeping. Now that I had participated in their ritual and become of the cruciform, they seemed to have lost interest in me. As I stripped to bathe, I decided to take no interest in them. I decided that I would leave as soon as I was strong enough. I would find a way around the flame forests if necessary. I could descend the staircase and follow the cans if I had to. I knew more than ever that word of these miraculous artifacts had to be brought to the outside world. I pulled off the heavy robe, stood pale and shivering in the morning light, and went to lift the small cruciform from my chest. It did not come off. It lay there as if it were part of my flesh. I pulled, scraped, and tore at the thong until it snapped and fell away. I clawed at the cross-shaped lump on my chest. It did not come off. It was as if my flesh had sealed itself around the edges of the cruciform. Except for the scratches from my fingernails, there was no pain or physical sensation in the cruciform or surrounding flesh, only sheer terror in my soul at the thought of this thing attached to me. After the first rush of panic subsided, I sat a minute and then hastily pulled on my robe and ran back to the village. My knife was gone, my mazer, scissors, razor, everything that might have helped me peel back the growth on my chest. My nails left bloody tracks across the red welt in my chest. Then I remembered the med scanner. I passed the transceiver over my chest, read the disky display, shook my head in disbelief, and then ran an entire body scan. After a while, I keyed in a request for hard copies of the scan results, and sat motionless for a very long time. I sit here now, holding the image wafers. The cruciform is quite visible on both the sonic and K-cross images, as are the internal fibers that spread like thin tentacles, like roots, throughout my body. Excess ganglia radiate from a thick nucleus above my sternum to filaments everywhere, a nightmare of nematodes. As well as I can tell with my simple field scanner, the nematodes terminate in the amygdala and other basal ganglia in each cerebral hemisphere. My temperature, metabolism, and lymphocyte levels are normal. There has been no invasion of foreign tissue. According to the scanner, the nematodic filaments are the results of extensive but simple metastasis. According to the scanner, the cruciform itself is composed of familiar tissue. The DNA is mine. I am of the cruciform. Day 116. Each day, I paced the confines of my cage, the flame forests to the south and east, the forested ravines to the northeast, and the cleft to the north and west. The 70 will not let me descend into the cleft beyond the basilica. The cruciform will not let me get more than 10 kilometers from the cleft. At first, I could not believe this. I had resolved to enter the flame forest, trusting to luck and to God's help to see me through, but I had gone no more than 2 kilometers into the fringes of the forest when pain struck me in the chest and arms and head. I was sure I was having a massive heart attack, but as soon as I turned back toward the cleft, the symptoms ceased. I experimented for some time, and the results were invariably the same. Whenever I ventured deeper into the flame forest, away from the cleft, the pain would return and increase in severity until I turned back. I began to understand other things. Yesterday, I happened across the wreckage of the original Sea Ship's shuttle as I explored to the north. Only a rusted, vine-enmeshed wreck of metal remains among the rocks at the edge of the flame forest near the ravine. But, crouching among the exposed alloy ribs of the ancient craft, I could imagine the rejoicing of the 70 survivors, their short voyage to the cleft, their eventual discovery of the basilica, and what? Conjectures beyond that point are useless, but suspicions remain. Tomorrow I will attempt another physical exam of one of the Baikura. Perhaps now that I am of the cruciform, they will allow it. Each day I do a med scan of myself. The nematodes remain, perhaps thicker, perhaps not. I am convinced that they are purely parasitic, although my body has shown no signs of this. I peer at my face in the pool near the waterfall and see only the same long, aging continents that I have learned to dislike in recent years. This morning, while gazing at my image in the water, I opened my mouth wide, half thinking that I would see gray filaments and nematodic clusters growing from the roof of my mouth and the back of my throat. There was nothing. Day 117. The Baikura are sexless, not celibate, or hermaphroditic, or underdeveloped, sexless. They are as devoid of external or internal genitalia as a child's flow-form doll. There is no evidence that the penis or testes or comparable female organs have atrophied or been surgically altered. There is no sign that they ever existed. Urine is conducted through a primitive urethra, terminating in a small chamber contiguous with the anus, a sort of crude cloaca. Beta allowed the examination. The med scanner confirmed what my eyes would not believe. Del and Theta also agreed to be scanned. I have absolutely no doubt that the rest of the 70 are equally sexless. There is no sign that they have been altered. I would suggest that they have that they had all been born that way, but from what kind of parents? And how do these sexless lumps of human clay plan to reproduce? It must be tied in with the cruciform in some way. When I was finished with their med scans, I stripped and studied myself. The cruciform rises from my chest like pink scar tissue, but I am still a man. For how long? Day 133. Alpha is dead. I was with him 3 mornings ago when he fell. We were about 3 kilometers east, hunting for kalmatubers in the large boulders near the edge of the cleft. It had been raining most of the past 2 days, and the rocks were quite slippery. I looked up from my own scrambling just in time to see Alpha lose his footing and go sliding down a broad slab of stone over the edge. He did not shout. The only sound was the rasp of his robe against the rock, following several seconds later by the sickening dropped melon sound of his body striking a ledge 80 meters below. It took me an hour to find a route down to him. Even before I began the treacherous descent, I knew it was too late to help, but it was my duty. Alpha's body was half wedged between 2 large rocks. He must have died instantly. His arms and legs were splintered, and the right side of his skull had been crushed. Blood and brain tissue clung to the wet rock like the refuse of a sad picnic. I wept as I stood over the little body. I do not know why I wept, but I did. And as I wept, I administered extreme unction, and prayed that God would accept the soul of this poor, sexless little person. Later, I wrapped the body in vines, laboriously climbed the 80 meters of the cliff, and, pausing frequently to pant with exhaustion, pulled the broken corpse up to me. There was little interest as I carried the body of Alpha into the Baikura village. Eventually, Beta and half a dozen others wandered over to stare down indifferently at the corpse. No one asked me how he had died. After a few minutes, the small crowd disappeared. Later, I carried Alpha's body to the promontory, where I had buried Tuck so many weeks earlier. I was digging the shallow grave with a flat stone when Gamma appeared. The Baikura's eyes widened, and for a brief second I thought I saw emotion cross those bland features. "What are you doing?" asked Gamma. "Burying him." I was too tired to say more. I leaned against a thick calmer root and rested. "No," it was a command. "He is of the cruciform." I stared as Gamma turned and walked quickly back to the village. When the Baikura was gone, I pulled off the crude fiber tarp I had draped over the corpse. Alpha was, without any doubt, truly dead. It no longer mattered to him or the universe whether he was of the cruciform or not. The fall had stripped him of most of his clothes and all of his dignity. The right side of his skull had been cracked and emptied like a breakfast egg. One eye stared sightlessly toward Hyperion's sky through a thickening film, while the other looked out lazily from under a drooping lid. His rib cage had been splintered so thoroughly that shards of bone protruded from his flesh. Both arms were broken, and his left leg had been twisted almost off. I'd used the medical scanner to perform a perfunctory autopsy, and it had revealed massive internal injuries. Even the poor devil's heart had been pulped by the force of the fall. I reached out and touched the cold flesh. Rigor mortis was setting in. My fingers brushed across the cross-shaped welt on his chest, and I quickly pulled my hand away. The cruciform was warm. "Stand away." I looked up to see Beta and the rest of the Baikura standing there. I had no doubt that they would murder me in a second if I did not move away from the corpse. And as I did so, an idiotically frightened part of my mind noted that the 70 were now the 79. It seemed funny at the time. The Baikura lifted the body and moved back toward the village. Beta looked at the sky, looked at me, and said, "It is almost time. You will come." We went down into the cleft. The body was carefully tied into a basket of vines and lowered with us. The sun was not yet illuminating the interior of the basilica when they set Alpha's corpse on the broad altar and removed his remaining rags. I do not know what I expected next. Some ritual act of cannibalism, perhaps. Nothing would have surprised me. Instead, one of the Baikura raised his arms, just as the first shafts of colored light entered the basilica, and intoned, "You will follow the cross all of your days." The 70 knelt and repeated the sentence. I remained standing. I did not speak. "You will be of the cruciform all of your days," said the little Baikura, and the basilica echoed to the chorus of voices repeating the phrase. Light the color and texture of clotting blood through a huge shadow of the cross on a far wall. "You will be of the cruciform now and forever and ever," came the chant, as the winds rose outside and the organ pipes of the canyon wailed with the voice of a tortured child. When the Baikura stopped chanting, I did not whisper amen. I stood there while the others turned and left, with the sudden, total indifference of spoiled children who had lost interest in their game. "There's no reason to stay," said Beta when the others had gone. "I want to," I said, expecting a command to leave. Beta turned without so much as a shrug and left me there. The light dimmed. I went outside to watch the sunset, and when I returned, it had begun. Once, years ago in school, I saw a time-lapse holo showing the decomposition of a kangaroo mouse. A week's slow work of nature's recycling had been accelerated to 30 seconds of horror. There was this sudden, almost comic bloating of the little corpse, then the stretching of flesh into lesions, followed by the sudden appearance of maggots in the mouth, eyes, and open sores, and finally the sudden and incredible corkscrew cleaning of meat from the bones. There was no other phrase that fits the image, as the pack of maggots spiraled right to left, head to tail, in a time-lapse helix of carrion consumption that left behind nothing but bones and gristle and hide. Now it was a man's body I watched. I stopped and stared, the last of the light fading quickly. There was no sound in the echoing silence of the basilica, except for the pounding of my pulse in my own ears. I stared as Alpha's corpse first twitched, and then visibly vibrated, almost levitating off the altar in the spastic violence of sudden decomposition. For a few seconds, the cruciform seemed to increase in size and deepen in color, glowing as red as raw meat, and I imagined then that I had caught a glimpse of the network of filaments and nematodes holding the disintegrating body together like metal fibers in a sculptor's melting model. The flesh flowed. I stayed in the basilica that night. The area around the altar remained lit by the glow of the cruciform on Alpha's chest. When the corpse moved, the light would cast strange shadows on the walls. I did not leave the basilica until Alpha left on the third day, but most of the visible changes had taken place by the end of that first night. The body of the Bakura I had named Alpha was broken down and rebuilt as I watched. The corpse that was left was not quite Alpha and not quite not Alpha, but it was intact. The face was a flow-form doll's face, smooth and unlined, features stamped in a slight smile. At sunrise of the third day, I saw the corpse's chest begin to rise and fall, and I heard the first intake of breath. A rasp, like water being poured into a leather pouch. Shortly before noon, I left the basilica to climb the vines. I followed Alpha. He has not spoken, will not reply. His eyes have a fixed, unfocused look, and occasionally he pauses as if he hears distant voices calling. No one paid attention to us when we returned to the village. Alpha went to a hut and sits there now. I sit in mine. A minute ago, I opened my robe and ran my fingers across the welt of the cruciform. It lies benignly under the flesh of my chest, waiting. Day 140. I am recovering from my wounds and the loss of blood. It cannot be cut out with a sharpened stone. It does not like pain. I lost consciousness long before the pain or the loss of blood demanded it. Each time I awoke and resumed cutting, I would be made to pass out. It does not like pain. Day 158. Alpha speaks some now. He seems duller, slower, and only vaguely aware of me, or anyone else, but he eats and moves. He appears to recognize me to some extent. The med scanner shows the heart and internal organs of a young man, perhaps of a boy of 16. I must wait about another Hyperion month and 10 days, about 50 days in all, until the flame forests become quiet enough for me to try to walk out, pain or no pain. We will see who can stand the most pain. Day 173. Another death. The one called Will, the one with the broken finger, had been missing for a week. Yesterday, the Bakura went several kilometers northeast, as if following a beacon, and found the remains near the great ravine. Evidently, a branch had snapped while he was climbing to grasp some calm fronds. Death must have been instantaneous when he broke his neck, but it is where he fell that is important. The body, if one could call it that, was lying between two great mud cones, marking the burrows of the large red insects that Tuck called fire mantises. Carpet beetles might have been a more apt phrase. In the past few days, the insect had stripped the corpse clean to the bone. Little was left to be found except the skeleton, some random shreds of tissue and tendon, and the cruciform, still attached to the ribcage, like some splendid cross packed in the sarcophagus of a long-dead pope. It is terrible, but I cannot help but feel some sense of triumph beneath the sadness. There is no way that the cruciform can regenerate something out of those bare bones. Even the terrible illogic of these accursed parasites must respect the imperative of the law of conservation of mass. The Bakura I call Will has died the true death. The 70 truly are the 69 from this time on. Day 174. I am a fool. Today I inquired about Will, about his dying the true death. I was curious at the lack of a reaction from the Bakura. They had retrieved the cruciform, but left the skeleton lying where they had found it. There was no attempt to carry the remains to the basilica. During the night I had become concerned that I would be made to fill the role of the missing member of the 70. It is very sad, I said, that one of your dead, you has died the true death. What is to become of the 70? Beta stared at me. He cannot die the true death, said the bald little androgyny. He is of the cruciform. Somewhat later, while continuing my med scans of the tribe, I discovered the truth. The one I have tagged as Theta looks the same and acts the same, but now carries 2 cruciforms embedded in his flesh. I have no doubt that this is one Bakura who will tend toward corpulence in the coming years, swelling and ripening like some obscene E. coli cell in a petri dish. When it dies, 2 will leave the tomb, and the 70 will be complete once more. I believe I am going mad. Day 195. Weeks of studying the damn parasite, and still no clue as to how it functions. Worse, I no longer care. What I care about now is more important. Why has God allowed this obscenity? Why have the Bakura been punished this way? Why was I chosen to suffer their fate? I ask these questions in nightly prayers, but I hear no answers. only the blood song of wind from the cleft. Day 214. The last 10 pages should have covered all of my field notes and technical conjectures. This will be my last entry before attempting the quiescent flame forest in the morning. There is no doubt that I have discovered the ultimate in stagnant human societies. The Bakura have realized the human dream of immortality and have paid for it with their humanity and their immortal souls. Edward, I have spent so many hours wrestling with my faith, my lack of faith, but now, in this fearful corner of an all but forgotten world, riddled as I am with this loathsome parasite, I have somehow rediscovered a strength of belief, the likes of which I have not known since you and I were boys. I now understand the need for faith, pure, blind, fly in the face of reason faith, as a small life preserver in the wild and endless sea of a universe ruled by unfeeling laws and totally indifferent to the small reasoning beings that inhabit it. Day after day I have tried to leave the cleft area, and day after day I have suffered pain so terrible that it has become a tangible part of my world, like the too small sun or the green and lapis sky. Pain has become my ally, my guardian angel, my remaining link with humanity. The cruciform does not like pain, nor do I, but, like the cruciform, I am willing to use it to serve my purposes, and I will do so consciously, not instinctively like the mindless mass of alien tissue embedded in me. This thing only seeks a mindless avoidance of death by any means. I do not wish to die, but I welcome pain and death rather than an eternity of mindless life. Life is sacred. I still hold to that as a core element of the Church's thought and teachings these past 2,800 years, when life has been so cheap. But even more sacred is the soul. I realize now that what I was trying to do with the Armagas data was to offer the Church not a rebirth, but only a transition to a false life, such as these poor walking corpses inhabit. If the Church is meant to die, it must do so, but do so gloriously, in the full knowledge of its rebirth in Christ. It must go into the darkness not willingly, but well, bravely, and firm of a faith, like the millions who have gone before us, keeping faith with all those generations facing death in the isolated silence of death camps, and nuclear fireballs, and cancer wards, and pogroms, going into the darkness, if not hopefully, then prayerfully, and there is some reason for it all, something worth the price of all that pain, all those sacrifices. All those before us have gone into the darkness without assurance of logic or fact or pervasive theory, with only a slender thread of hope, or the all-too-shakeable conviction of faith. And if they have been able to sustain that slim hope in the face of darkness, then so must I, and so must the Church. I no longer believe that any surgery or treatment can cure me of this thing that infests me. But if someone can separate it and study it and destroy it, even at the cost of my death, I will be well satisfied. The flame forests are as quiet as they will ever be. To bed now. I leave before dawn. Day 215. There is no way out. 14 kilometers into the forest. Stray fires and bursts of current, but penetrable. 3 weeks of walking would have got me through. The cruciform will not let me go. The pain was like a heart attack that would not stop. Still, I staggered forward, stumbling and crawling through the ash. Eventually, I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was crawling toward the cleft. I would turn away, walk a kilometer, crawl 50 meters, and then lose consciousness again, and awake back where I had started. All day, this insane battle for my body went on. Before sunset, the Baikura entered the forest, found me 5 kilometers from the cleft, and carried me back. Dear Jesus, why have you let this be? There is no hope now, unless someone comes looking for me. Day 223. Again the attempt. Again the pain. Again the failure. Day 257. I am 68 standard years old today. Work goes on with the chapel I am building near the cleft. Attempted to descend to the river yesterday, but was turned back by Beta and 4 others. Day 280. 1 local year on Hyperion. 1 year in purgatory. Or is it hell? Day 311. working on quarrying stones on the ledges below the shelf where the chapel is going up, and I made the discovery today. The arrestor rods. The Baikura must have thrown them over the edge when they murdered Tuck that night 223 days ago. These rods would allow me to penetrate the flame forests at any time, if the cruciform would allow it. But it will not. If only they had not destroyed my medkits with the painkillers. But still, sitting there, holding the rods today, I have an idea. My crude experiments with the med scanner have continued. 2 weeks ago, when Theta broke his leg in 3 places, I observed the reaction of the cruciform. The parasite did its best to block the pain. Theta was unconscious much of the time, and his body was producing incredible quantities of endorphins. But the break was a very painful one, and after 4 days, the Baikura slashed Theta's throat and took his body to the basilica. It was easier for the cruciform to resurrect his corpse than to tolerate such pain over a long period. But before his murder, my scanner showed an appreciable retreat of the cruciform nematodes from some parts of the central nervous system. I do not know if it would be possible to inflict on oneself or to tolerate levels of non-lethal pain sufficient to drive the cruciform out completely, but I am sure of one thing. The Baikura would not allow it. Today I sit on the ledge below the half-finished chapel, and I consider the possibilities. Day 438. The chapel is finished. It is my life's work. Tonight, when the Baikura went down into the cleft for their daily parody of worship, I said Mass at an altar of the newly erected chapel. I had baked the bread from cauliflower, and I'm sure that it must have tasted of that bland yellow leaf, but to me the taste was exactly like that of the first host I had partaken of during my first Holy Communion in Villafranca-sur-Saône some 60 standard years earlier. In the morning I will do what I have planned. Everything is in readiness. My journals and the MedScan wafers will be in a pouch of woven Bestos fibers. That is the best I can do. The consecrated wine was only water, but in the dim light of sunset it looked blood red and tasted of communion wine. The trick will be to penetrate deep enough into the flame forest. I will have to trust that there is enough incipient activity in and from the Tesla trees even during the quiet periods. Goodbye, Edward. I doubt if you are still alive, and should you be, I see no way that we could ever be reunited, separated as we are, not only by years of distance, but by a much wider gulf in the form of a cross. My hope of seeing you again shall not be placed in this life, but in the one to come. Strange to hear me speak like this again, is it not? I must tell you, Edward, that after all these decades of uncertainty, and with great fear of what lies ahead, my heart and soul are none the less at peace. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins, because of the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because I have offended thee, my God, who art all good, and deserving of all my love. I firmly resolve, with the help of thy grace, to confess my sins, to do penance, and to amend my life. Amen. 2400 hours. The sunset comes through the open chapel window and bathes the altar, the crudely carved chalice, and me in light. The wind from the cleft rises in the last such chorus that, with luck and God's mercy, I will ever hear. That is the final entry, said Lenarhoit. When the priest quit reading, the 6 pilgrims at the table raised their faces toward him as if they were awakening from a common dream. The council glanced upward and saw that Hyperion was much closer now, filling a third of the sky, banishing the stars with its cold radiance. I arrived some 10 weeks after I had last seen Father Durr, continued Father Hoyt. His voice was a hoarse rasp. More than 8 years had passed on Hyperion, 7 years since the last entry in Father Durr's journal. The priest was visibly in pain now, his face pale to a sick luminescence and filmed with perspiration. Within a month, I found my way to Presebo Plantation upriver from Port Romance, he continued, forcing some strength into his voice. My assumption was that the fiberplastic growers might tell me the truth, even if they would have nothing to do with the consulate or home rule authorities. I was right. The administrator at Presebo, a man named Orlandi, remembered Father Durr, as did Orlandi's new wife, the woman named Sempha, who Father Durr had mentioned in his journals. The plantation manager had tried to mount several rescue operations onto the plateau, but an unprecedented series of active seasons in the flame forest had made them abandon their attempts. After several years, they had given up hope that Durr or their man Tuck could still be alive. Nonetheless, Orlandi recruited 2 expert bush pilots to fly a rescue expedition up the cleft in 2 plantation skimmers. We stayed in the cleft itself for as long as we could, trusting to Terran avoidance instruments and luck to get us to Baikura country. Even with bypassing most of the flame forest that way, we lost one of the skimmers and 4 people to Tesla activity. Father Hoyt paused and swayed slightly. Gripping the edge of the table to steady himself, he cleared his throat and said, "There's little else to say." We located the Baikura village. There were 70 of them, each as stupid and uncommunicative as Durr's notes had suggested. I managed to ascertain from them that Father Durr had died while trying to penetrate the flame forest. The Bestos pouch had survived, and in it we found his journals and medical data. Hoyt looked at the others a second and then glanced down. "We persuaded them to show us where Father Durr had died," he said. They had not buried him. His remains were badly burned and decomposed, but complete enough to show us that the intensity of the Tesla charges had destroyed the cruciform, as well as his body. Father Durr had died the true death. We returned the remains to the Placebo plantation, where he was buried, following a full funeral mass. Hoyt took a deep breath. Over my strong objections, M. Orlandi destroyed the Baikura village and a section of the cleft wall with shaped nuclear charges he had brought from the plantation. I do not believe that any of the Baikura could have survived. As far as we could tell, the entrance to the labyrinth and the so-called basilica also must have been destroyed in the landslide. I had sustained several injuries during the expedition, and thus I had to remain at the plantation for several months before returning to the northern continent and booking passage to Passam. No one knows of these journals or their contents except M. Orlandi, Monsignor Edouard, and whichever of his superiors Monsignor Edouard chose to tell. As far as I know, the Church has issued no declaration relating to the journals of Father Paul Durr. Father Hoyt had been standing, and now he sat. Sweat dripped from his chin, and his face was blue-white in the reflected light of Hyperion. "Is that all?" said Martin Silenus. "Yes," managed Father Hoyt. "Gentlemen and lady," said Het Mastine, "it is late. I suggest that you gather your luggage and rendezvous at our friend the Council's ship on Sphere 11 in 30 minutes or sooner. I will be using one of the tree's drop ships to join you later." That is where we will leave the story for this evening. Do you see why I stopped where I did? Well, I hope you have a lovely week, and I hope you enjoyed listening. I will see you next week.